This is the March 11 edition of Breaking the Line, the ECNL podcast featuring ECNL President and CEO Christian Lavers and ECNL VP and Chief of Staff Doug Bracken. Today they are joined once again by ECNL's Chief Medical Advisor, I think one of the all-time great people, and Dr. Drew Watson, and they are going to cover specialization in a big way. They're going to debunk some myths. They're going to talk about what is real and what isn't. They're going to talk about the fact that parents should know how much their kids are doing as well. And it's a great conversation, and we'll get rolling after we hear from around the league. And we'll start things off by saying congrats to Anaya Nevaeh Lopez Acuna of Match Fit Surf ECNL and goalkeeper at the Florida Winter National Selection Game on her call up to the Mexican U17 National Camp via the support of the Heritage Project. We're in early March, and Michigan Hawks have already qualified for the ECNL Girls National Playoffs in the U15, U16, U17, and 18-19 age groups, with their U13 and U14 teams not far behind. Sting Soccer Club has also seen success in the Texas Conference, as multiple teams are primed to qualify across the Sting Dallas Royal, Sting Dallas Black, and Sting Austin programs. In the ECNL Regional League Girls, a much-deserved congratulations to Team Boca, Lone Star SC, and South Carolina Surf, all of whom earned promotion into ECNL Girls next season. The ECNL Regional League Girls hosted its inaugural Leaders Cup event at ECNL Florida, with 4 teams bringing home trophies. Beach FC out of California in the 18-19s, Utah Surf in the U17s, Lone Star SC in the U16s, and SoCal Blues in the U15s. Congratulations to these teams as well. On the boys' side, the ECNL continues to see active players and alumni make an impact on the international stage. Nick Simmons was called into the January U20 U.S. Men's National Team camp, and Landry Walker, a current San Antonio FC player, competed with the U17s in the CONCACAF World Cup qualifiers. Also in the January U20 camp was Griffin Garnett, who recently signed a 6-figure, record-breaking transfer agreement to compete in the Europa League with the Hungarian club Ferencvárosi TC. In ECNL Regional League Boys, Tennessee United is sitting at the top of RL Mid-America in 5 out of 6 age groups, with 6 games left to play at the U13 and U14 ages. Thanks to their play, Tennessee United, along with Coastal Rush, have earned promotion into ECNL Boys next season. In the pre-ECNL, the pre-ECNL Champions Cup continues to take shape, with clubs such as Crossfire Premier, Florida Premier, Real Colorado, and PDA all having qualified for the event. The ECNL was also ecstatic to announce 5 major international clubs who will compete in the ECNL International Iber Cup in September at WRAL Soccer Park in Raleigh. AC Milan, Benfica, Gremio, Man United, and Yokohama F. Marinos will all come stateside for the event, with more major international clubs to come. For ECNL's Around the League, I'm Dean Linky. Around the League is done. You already know that Christian Lavers and Doug Bracken have Dr. Drew Watson on this show talking about specialization, including whether maybe more injuries are involved, and kind of debunking a bunch of myths. A great conversation with 3 wonderful people. And we get started now as I turn it over to Christian Lavers.
All right. Thank you very much, Dean, for that introduction as usual. Doug, you're back from vacation.
Yes, I am. Thank you. Thank you for having me back. I was unsure whether I would be welcome back or not, but somebody sent me the link to this, and so here I am again.
I mean, welcome implies some sort of positive sentiment, I suppose. So, well, you're back.
I'm going to take that, and I'm going to take the positive sentiment part of it.
There you go.
Yes.
And of course, we'll have to welcome Dr. Drew Watson.
It's like our third best podcast contributor, I'd say. He's got
third best or third most?
Third best.
Oh, all right.
Third best, yeah. It's we're going to talk a lot about scientific stuff when Dr. Drew's on. So I did a study, and he came out as third best.
Oh, nice. I'm sure that was peer reviewed. Drew, you're on the podium, so that's good.
Yeah, I guess I'll just have to try and use this episode to work myself a little bit higher up on the list.
Like listen back to all the episodes and see like who might be like above you a little bit. You know?
Got my work cut out for me. Yeah, well, now I'm curious who my competition is, how I seek them out and overcome it.
That's right.
Well, we have Dr. Drew back here. I'm not going to call you Dr. Drew. I'm just going to say Drew from now on. I'm going to
Thank you.
drop the honorific. We have Drew back as we're talking about a release that was just made, sent out by the ECNL Center for Athlete Health and Performance, which of course Drew is the director of and doing in part with his Human Performance Lab at the University of Wisconsin and a bunch of other stuff. But the really interesting topic here of sports specialization and injury risk, which I think, Drew, you have a little bit a historical perspective to maybe set some context to. I will just preface that with a topic that is probably frequently grossly exaggerated or grossly misunderstood, potentially. It's a better way of saying it. But I'll turn it over to you to give a little bit of context on the research that was just released today by the center.
Yeah, so I mean, I spend a lot of time around specialization and different outcomes, and I think the history around it is interesting. I think a lot of people don't necessarily appreciate exactly how we got to the information that we see today and in all of our feeds, but really it sort of builds off research that started back in the 80s and 90s. And this was primarily people looking at how beneficial sports were for a whole host of outcomes, from academic outcomes to physical fitness outcomes to social outcomes for kids. And this sort of built into research in the early 2000s, looking at different athletic developmental models. And a lot of that informed the subsequent research around specialization. And in kind of like 2010 to 2015, we saw some initial research looking at the relationship between sports specialization and injury. And we can sort of belabor what exactly sports specialization means later if you like. It's actually not a well defined construct, but that's really when that started to come out. And then in like 2015 to 2020, there was just this huge sort of wave of what I'll probably go on to qualify as being relatively low level evidence, looking at just relationships between sports specialization and all sorts of things. And on the heels of that, you got lots of consensus statements, lots of policy recommendations, and this larger narrative around sports specialization. But what I think those of us who spend a lot of time in it recognized around that time was that the level of evidence was relatively low, meaning there was very, very little prospective, well controlled research. There was very little sport specific research. And we didn't even really have a good functional working definition of what specialization was that we could apply in sort of broader contexts. So, with all of that in mind, what we wanted to try and do was answer just sort of a very narrow question about whether or not sports specialization was related to injury in youth soccer players if you controlled for the clear potential confounder of training load. In other words, if specialized athletes report more injuries than non-specialized, is this a function of training load or something else? So
So
that's
can
what
we pause there for a second?
Yeah.
So, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I want to just call out a few things. So there's a few different topics or discussion points that come with specialization, right? And you have people that jump very quickly to conclusions without a lot of evidence, which is one of the topics that you just referenced. There's also a varying themes in this about, is specialization good or bad? We're not particularly talking about that yet on this topic. We're first talking about this general statement that if you specialize in a sport, you have a higher level of injury risk, right? So that's a specific hypothesis that we're addressing here. And I think you said it very quickly, but I want to highlight, first of all, that in this general statement of specialization causes more injury risk, that hypothesis, the first issue is what is exactly meant by specialization? And how do you put an athlete into one category or another, which that seems, when you say that, it seems like a really obvious question that in order to have any hypothesis, you'd have to have a clear and generally agreed upon definition of what specialization is or is not. And I think you're saying that that wasn't even clearly articulated in that statement, which maybe starts to pull on the string to say how weak some of the evidence is. And by the way, we're not saying there's nothing there, and that I don't think that's the conclusion you're going to have either on this. But maybe talk first more about that definition of specialization.
Could I just add to that? Because I think there's something that I wonder coming off the back of that, and that is, what do you think, maybe as part of how you answer this, what do you think got them to the hypothesis that sports specialization, whatever we decide it is, gets you to a higher injury risk?
Yeah. So the first one about sort of the definition of specialization is actually a bit of a moving target. So early on, one of the sort of conventional ways this was done was to categorize athletes as either low, moderate, or high specialization based on questions like, had they quit other sports to focus on their main sport? Did they play it for 8 months of the year? Other sort of characteristics, but it was basically based on around 4 questions that were used to categorize kids in a certain way. This was really just sort of developed by one of the first groups to look at this. It wasn't ever validated. And in my mind, it's a little bit hard to take something as complicated as human behaviors and decision-making around sports and put kids into 3 buckets based on that. That seems a little bit sort of arbitrary. But to your point, Doug, I think, I was sort of coming into my position around the time that this was starting. And I think there was this sense within clinical spaces that there was this population of kids that were maybe overdoing it or overtraining with respect to a certain activity because for whatever reason they were doing it a lot, and this was maybe setting them up for injury. So it was really just kind of a suspicion based on clinical interactions with kids and families. So that sort of conventional definition of specialization is definitely not used universally, but it became one of the more commonly used ones. But again, I would make the point that it never really was truly validated. It became kind of conventional, but at Wisconsin, some of my partners and I have actually been working over the last few years to really develop a truly validated measure of specialization as a much more complicated construct than just something as simple as, how many months of a year do you play something and whether or not you've quit other things. And that work is sort of evolving, and that's kind of coming into use now. But the historical data around this is very much about grouping athletes into 1 or 2 categories and then comparing things between them. And maybe where you were going to go next, Christian, I think, is just when I say low-level evidence, what I'm talking about is that the overwhelming majority of the information about specialization and injury is what's called cross-sectional data, which basically means you give a whole bunch of kids a survey, you ask them these questions that categorize their specialization level, and then you ask them if they've been hurt in the last, say, year. And then you just look at whether or not there's a difference in the injury proportion or total between those specialization groups. And that's sort of what kicked all this off, is there's a lot of early research that found that if you did this, what you'd find is that the kids who report higher levels of specialization are more likely to report having had an injury in the last year. And to me, that's all well and good as a very, very early basic step in a much broader sort of research effort to find out what is really causing something. Because information like that can be badly confounded. And there are lots and lots of examples of this where we find relationships in cross-sectional data. And then when we actually do studies over time, we find the relationship doesn't exist anymore. This was true for mouth guards and concussion. It was true for stretching and injuries. It's true for all sorts of issues in healthcare. is that if you make decisions based on cross-sectional data, you're likely to badly overestimate relationships and even have causal relationships going in the wrong direction. The problem is there's been very little information that is actually built on that. There's just been more and more and more cross-sectional data, and then you generate policy statements and consensus statements around that, and you run a very real risk of overestimating the relationship between these things, misattributing causal relationships, and you really don't get any information about what holds true within a specific sport if you were going to try to give advice to a family or an athlete.
Okay, so you have a generalized statement that the data itself in a cross-sectional type study is not great data. It can be greatly over, I don't want to say over exaggerated, but maybe it's missing specificity or controls or detail to make it easy to draw accurate conclusions. I also will just keep pounding on this definition of specialization, right? Because again, when you first hear this statement, you assume that that is well understood what it meant. But to me, there's a question of, is it specialized if I play only one sport, but I only do it twice a week? That doesn't sound like specialized to me. That sounds like just a fun activity I do every now and then. And then you also probably have, well, what if I'm doing a lot of sports a lot of times a week? And then you have, what if different sports at different times of the year, and how much am I doing each one of them? So you have all of these different things where somebody has to draw the line and say, well, as of this point, you move from the bucket of non-specialized to specialized, or less specialized to more specialized. It just immediately starts. I can see like Swiss cheese, holes coming into these conclusions. And then your last comment then is, by the way, not all sports are equal in terms of the type of movements and activities that they require in terms of how varied they are. So with all of that said, maybe let's jump into then you went and said, I want to go specific and do better research on a specific sport with some definition of specialization, which I'm sure you can explain, and then what you concluded from that information.
Yeah. So, I mean, you're right. Any way you define this in a categorical way, you're going to end up with edge cases that feel like they don't really fit very well. So when you're using these sorts of questions to discriminate individuals, you're always going to bump into issues where it maybe doesn't feel like it's accurately putting them into the right bucket, so to speak. So just to put a finer point on it, like the most commonly used scale historically was this 3-question scale that simply asked, do you identify one main sport that you play more than any other? Yes or no. Have you quit other sports to focus on this main sport? Yes or no. And do you train in this main sport for more than 8 months of the year? Yes or no. And based on the answers there, you either end up as low, moderate, or high. That's how it's sort of conventionally been used in the past. It's simple, it's quick. Nobody quits doing the survey in the middle of 3 questions like they might with 20. So it gets used almost sort of out of convenience, like it's built out of the way that we might imagine this sort of quote unquote specialized athlete we have in mind as answering these things. But again, has its own shortcomings. I mean, it's worth pointing out, like there have been a couple of prospective studies that have aggregated kind of all sports together to find kids using this scale and then followed them out to see whether the injury rates are different between specialized or highly or low specialized athletes. One of those didn't involve me, but was down the hall from some of my colleagues in Wisconsin. And they did this with high school athletes. So they aggregated all the sports together, defined their specialization level, followed them out. And what they found was that highly specialized athletes were more likely to have chronic lower extremity injuries than the other groups. There was another study that did the same thing within Swedish high school academy athletes and found no relationship. So like even when you aggregate sports together, it's not really clear what this relationship is, and it really doesn't look like the cross-sectional information.
So you have two studies, and one in the US, one in Sweden, coming to opposite conclusions with the same general question. And then, if I'm understanding you correctly, when you aggregate all the sports, you can't tell which, there may be one or two sports that is dragging that number very high, and other sports that have nothing to do with it, but they get put into the same bucket because there's no ability or there was no attempt in that study to break it down, comparing sport to sport.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And this, for me, clinically, has been the hardest thing about this information because we have this sort of conversation with families all the time. Whether they're coming in for an initial evaluation of an injury and we're trying to identify what maybe the risk factors were, or if they're at the back end and looking for advice about what the safest way for kids to participate in sports was. If they were asking me specifically about soccer, I simply didn't know, right? There's nothing I can take from the available higher level evidence to tell me one way or the other whether choosing to participate exclusively in soccer is going to increase your risk of injury. And I think there's a lot of reason to think that whatever the relationship is between specialization and injury, it's different for different sports. It's going to not be the same for a baseball pitcher as it is for a football player, as it is for a soccer player, as it is for a golfer. I mean, all of these activities are so different. Whatever it is that we think about specializing in them that might influence injury is going to be different from one to the next. So what we really felt like we needed was prospective research that was sports specific so we could actually have conversations with people and help them make decisions based on the activities their kids actually wanted to do.
My question was, did you find, like, I can think, of a couple sports that have some repetitive movements in certain parts of the body that might be, I don't know if less durable is a good way to say it, but like I think like a pitcher in baseball, particularly at a young age in the way they throw, or a tennis player, or someone who's just a runner or sprinter, or something that's. Do you find there's some data that lends itself to maybe more if you're specializing in particular sports?
Yeah, I think there's no question. If you're a young pitcher with, growing bones, open growth plates, sort of evolving mechanics as your limbs grow and you are pitching a ton, we like all the time see medial elbow issues, right? This is just a simple overuse issue. If you pitch too much on vulnerable structures, they'll get damaged.
Mm-hmm.
Runners in particular who are doing very, very homogeneous movements, right? Like if you're on a track or if you're on a sidewalk, every step is loading the same structures over and over. So we see bone stress injuries in runners when their mileage is too high. But if you have heterogeneous movement patterns in a sport like soccer, which is highly variable, and you're on a softer surface, I was always having a hard time extrapolating information from runners and baseball players to sort of feel comfortable that soccer was going to have the same sort of relationship. The loads are just so variable and different. And
just to put a point on it, to compare baseball pitching or hitting to soccer is almost a moot point. It would actually be more accurate to compare it to if I took 100 penalty kicks a day with the same foot every day. Then I would not be surprised to have some repetitive injury type issues because it's the same movement over and over and over again. And obviously that is not what happens on a soccer field where you're running forward, backwards, sideways, jumping, sprinting, kicking, dribbling, all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. If for some reason soccer had a special position where all you did was drive goal kicks as hard as you could, I imagine you'd see a whole bunch of issues in the growth areas of people's hips. But that's just not how it's done. And again, so when we were sort of embarking on this, it was really trying to be in service of, how could you have an informed conversation with a family whose 12 or 13-year-old was like, I really like soccer, but I keep hearing all of this information that says if I choose to play that exclusively, I'm going to get hurt a lot more often. I think it's not unreasonable for people to arrive at that conclusion based on the information that sort of gets perpetuated within the youth sports media landscape. But when I have that conversation in clinic with young athletes, there really wasn't anything to lean on one way or the other. And I felt very awkward about telling a kid who really enjoyed playing soccer that they probably shouldn't because of information that was coming from elsewhere and might not be relevant within their context. So to try and get information that we felt like would actually be useful, we set out to do this prospective study where we actually controlled for training load through the course of 2 different seasons to see whether athletes who were multi-sport athletes or single sport athletes within soccer had different injury, when we actually looked at illness rates as well, but basically different health outcomes.
And by the way, it's almost, and the term is going to be slightly exaggerated, but it's almost like moral blackmail when somebody's saying, "Hey, if you play that sport and only that sport, your risks of injury are going to go way higher, which means you're not going to achieve your goals because you're going to be hurt all the time, and you're really undercutting like that." If that is true, it's important information. But if it is not true, and it is being bandied around just naively or glibly with very little backdrop for it, you're actually to your point, you're making somebody less likely or making it harder for them to do things they want to do that have no or a very low risk profile.
I mean, it is always so hard for anybody these days to say, I don't know,
I don't know.
particularly if you're supposed to be in a position where you're like an expert in an area. So like if somebody comes to me in clinic and is having this question, and I just say, well, there's all this cross-sectional data and there's all of this prospective data where things get lumped together. And so you shouldn't choose to play the sport that you love exclusively. That feels intellectually dishonest. But it is also difficult to be like, I don't know. And I say, I don't know all the time. And I'm sure it's unsatisfying for the person hearing it, but it is true. And I feel much more comfortable saying that than sort of misrepresenting available information and committing somebody to a path that actually isn't right for them. So long story short, this was sort of a collaborative effort with one of the clubs local to us over 2 separate years where we basically recruited the girls' side of the club starting at U13. And there are lots of pieces to this that aren't directly related in some ways to the specialization piece, but basically for 2 years for the fall season, which is what we get here in Wisconsin, the beginning of the season, we would ask them about sport participation for our purposes, kind of because of the numbers, but also because everybody in this group plays soccer most of the year. We just discriminated them as like they are exclusively soccer players or they are multi-sport athletes, meaning that they play soccer in addition to other things. We did a bunch of fitness testing at the start of both seasons. Every single day during the course of both seasons, they reported their training load, so duration and intensity of any activity, and then we recorded their injuries and their illnesses over the course of those 2 years.
And so by the way, just on the specialization, they were considered specialized. I mean, they all played soccer in the fall. Some of them then played a winter or a spring different sport like basketball or ran track or whatever. Some of them just played soccer year round. They could have done it soccer and club year round. They could have done soccer, club soccer in the fall, high school soccer in the spring. But that was the separation. You played just soccer or you played soccer and.
Yeah. I think what we were trying to get at is there a difference between those athletes who've chosen to focus and quote unquote specialize in soccer versus those athletes who've continued to play other sports alongside it? So, we use that same like 3 questions, but that I mentioned earlier, but all of them play soccer more than 8 months of the year. So it really just came down to whether they played any other sport or not. And had they quit other sports to focus on soccer. So the ones that we were qualifying as being specialized were those that just played soccer, and those those were non-specialized if they continued to be multi-sport athletes, which to me was kind of about as good as you could do to try and create sort of a branch point if you're having a conversation with a 12-year-old, for example, who's trying to decide what they want to do and really enjoy playing soccer. So specifically, we're trying to generate a little evidence to answer the question about whether they would be at more injury risk if they chose to just focus on soccer or if they continue to participate in multiple sports, which is what a lot of that sort of low-level cross-sectional data might suggest. So we follow them out for 2 years, and what that allows you to do is kind of to aggregate the years together. And so we had 80 individuals that participated overall, but 28 of them participated in both years. So you have 108 person years or athlete years. And what we found was that if you look at the proportion of individuals in the specialized and non-specialized groups that had an injury, there was no difference. If you looked at the injury rate after you control for training load between the two groups, there's no difference. Same was true for illnesses, just to bring that piece in. And so at least when you look at the girls' side of a club from U13 to 18, and you look at the injuries over 2 years, we just didn't see any difference in the injury rate between the specialized and the non-specialized athletes. They look very similar with respect to fitness, training load, and their injury rate. So for my purposes, when I'm trying to have conversations with families about what to do, I say exactly that. And in the end, what that makes me feel more comfortable doing is saying that you should be focusing on playing what you enjoy. And if you enjoy multiple things, do multiple things. And if you really like playing soccer, there's no available evidence I have that would suggest that doing that's going to put you at a bigger risk of injury.
And how many studies are out there like this?
So there's a couple of cross-sectional studies specifically about soccer. There was one 2019, I want to say, that was a survey of adolescent male soccer players that did sort of what we were talking about before, like asked them specialization questions and had they been hurt in the last year, and found no difference between the specialized and not specialized athletes with respect to injury risk. There was one in Japan that was similarly cross-sectional that found no relationship between specialization and injury risk. So for my part, somebody can always reach out to me and let me know otherwise. This is the only study I'm aware of that prospectively evaluated injury, the relationship between injury and specialization while controlling for training load in youth soccer players. There's been a similar one in basketball, similarly found no relationship between specialization and injury. And so I think there's starting to be a little bit more nuance around the way that these conversations get had, that when you subset out individuals within a more specific context, like their own sport or maybe gender specific, and you do it prospectively over time, we don't really find the same relationships that we were seeing in some of that cross-sectional data, which is actually pretty consistent with a fair amount of other health information.
So I take that as the people need to be a lot more careful of throwing out generalities about what the impact of specialization is on injury. I take your cross-sectional references of those two studies specific with soccer with the same sort of a little bit of be careful because it's cross-sectional, but it did point in the same direction as your prospective one when it was controlled for sport. I do think, how important is it when you talk about controlling for training load? Because really what we're saying there is that the methodology or the environment of the training is such that it's not every single day is, a 10 out of 10 of intensity where these kids are doing the exact same activity, even within soccer, right? There's a change in activity, a change in duration, a change in intensity level. So how important do you think that, and maybe this is an opportunity for you to say, I don't know, but how important is the training load control and the training methodology within the sport in these injury profiles?
I think it is critical. So just to belabor the whole like confounding and cross-sectional piece. So confounding just means that there's something that is related to the predictor and the outcome. So in the case of specialization and injury, if we find that specialization is associated with injury, so thinking about all of those cross-sectional studies, but there's anything that could be related to both of them, then it's possible that that association just gets explained by that third thing. And so training load is kind of an obvious one because you might expect that kids who are specialized in a sport might train more, which just means that they have more opportunities or exposures or hours within which they might have an injury. And if you don't control for training load, then you just sort of misassign the relationship between specialization and injury. And to your point, I think in the last like 10 or 15 years, and you guys would be able to speak to this better than me, but my impression is that within youth sports, we are much more thoughtful about load management. We're much more sort of proactive about thinking about how we manage individual level loads, let alone group loads. We think about how it fluctuates over time, maybe more than in the past. And I think part of what we might be seeing is that kids who are playing one sport have one person overseeing what they're doing. And if that person is really kind of on top of things, they're actually mindful of the loads that that player is exposed to over time. If you have athletes playing multiple things, neither coach has any idea what the other one is doing. And if they're doing those things simultaneously, I can tell you that my clinical experience has changed a lot in the last 10 years, where now what we see much, much more of is overuse or even acute injuries among athletes that are playing multiple sports at the same time and experiencing really relatively big loads because neither of the groups that they're playing for is aware of what the other is doing. And that to me is a much bigger risk than playing a single sport under somebody who's actually cognizant of how to manage.
So let's unpack that for we've used some maybe jargon here that could be helpful to explain a little bit more. So when we talk about training load, so a bad training load, let's just say, and you can agree or clarify on this, would be if I'm going to train 3 or 4 days a week and every day I'm going to push an hour and a half of max effort, fitness oriented session. So it's high intensity, it's high duration, and I'm going to do it Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. That would be considered, I guess I would say, bad training management of load because you're not giving the body physically any time to recover. So if you do that within a sport, you are going to see higher injury because you're pushing muscles and tissues to a point where there's not an appropriate recovery time. Then you talk about, and when you say improvement of training load, there's more understanding that if, hey, I'm going to push really hard on Monday on fitness, Tuesday needs to be less intense and shorter so that there's time for the body to physically recover. And maybe those are days where you focus more on tactical decision making or things that I'll make it cognitive load oriented. But then there are the things that even if you control within your sport and say, let's use a typical Tuesday, take a team that trains Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday in soccer. Tuesday might be a average load day because you might have had games on the weekend. So you're recovering a little bit, but you're 48 hours out, maybe a little longer than that. Wednesday tends to be your highest physical load session because it's midweek. So you have the max amount of time between the previous game and the upcoming game. And then Thursday tends to be a lower load, maybe high speed, but low load, so more rest time in that because you don't want to exhaust people for the game on Saturday, right? So you sort of have that curve right through the week. Even if you do that right within a soccer environment, if that same player is doing that with you in soccer Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, but then is going to basketball and they are doing even the exact same days, so their high load is Wednesday in soccer, then they go straight to a basketball practice, it's high load. Or maybe they're offset a little bit. The high load of soccer is Wednesday, and then they got a high load of basketball fitness on Thursday. That's when you see that combination of sport that is going to create actually a higher injury risk, arguably, than just doing one sport with a proper training methodology and load management.
I would say that exactly matches my clinical experience in the last few years. And I think there's plenty of data to back it up that the kids who are doing multiple things on the same day, multiple days of the week, when we unpack things in clinic, I find that much more these days than I do the athlete who's doing one thing at a time. I think we've had I mean, soccer coaches broadly and probably youth sports coaches in general across the country, I think every year get more and more sort of sophisticated in their understanding of how to incorporate recovery and how to time training loads. And I think that both duration and intensity are going to be independent risk factors for injury. Just the longer you're out there, the more likely you're going to be to get hurt. But the more intense it is, the more likely you are to have something get hurt. And I think just like you laid out, we sort of recognize more and more and more that you don't have to go hard all the time, that having built-in adequate recovery between periods of high loads is actually better for adaptation. And as a consequence, it's better for injury reduction. And it probably takes 48, maybe 72 hours to fully recover from a very big load. And so if you incorporate that for players on your own, right? Like if I have a group of soccer players and they don't do anything else and I'm fully in control of the loads that they receive, well, then I can be quite prescriptive and probably protective. But if I'm doing what I'm doing and then they're going and running cross country right afterwards, well, then I don't have any idea how to prescribe the loads to them. Or the players that, I mean, we've all had players who like went to cross country practice and then came to soccer. And that player I worry about a lot. Like that player is coming in fatigued, but they don't tell me. They just
hello hamstring tear.
Yeah.
Or worse. Yeah.
Or they just go into a tackle wrong, like they're a little late, like it's all the things that come from being
they're
fatigued.
Compromised. They come to you in a compromised state. That's why I've always kind of said like this idea of periodization, because Christian, you would agree that periodization was a very big buzzword, hot topic in our sport. And I don't necessarily think it's the concept of it is wrong, but actually applying it in youth soccer is almost impossible. Because to Drew's point, you don't know what you don't know. You could have a kid coming to you from doing something else directly. They don't say anything to you. You can't manage their load because they're doing things that you may or may not even know about.
Well, right? I think that's the point. And maybe this is kind of what you've said, Drew, about, talking about addressing mental health better is you have to have the conversation. And some of that, I think, extends to this is that, and I do think there are places or parents who feel like they don't want to tell the coach, hey, my kid is also doing this because maybe they feel like they'll get in trouble or, they don't want the coach to feel like the kid's less committed or whatever. But if the coach doesn't know what else you're doing, there's no chance that they can accommodate the load demand that's being added to it. And that also can include, let's just keep it within the same sport, right? So let's talk about the kid who's really into soccer. That's all they play. But then they also go to an individual technical trainer. And then they also go and do their lifting, right? Yeah. And they don't tell the team coach that, hey, on these days, I'm actually doing, max lifts, to build strength. And the strength coach doesn't have any idea what the team coach is doing. The technical coach, and by the way, individual technical work, and I think, Drew, you would say this, can be surprisingly high load, right? Mm-hmm. Because you are constantly changing directions and speed because it's just you and a ball. But if the team coach is not told that, there's no chance for them to build that into their consideration of how they treat that player's training load within the team.
Yeah. I mean, I would say everybody's in the dark, right? Like we very rarely would be like, okay, players, here's which days in the next 2 weeks are going to be the high load days. So make sure you tell your strength coach or your personal trainer or your whatever. Like nobody really knows. And I think if players and families aren't sort of coming and making it clear that they're doing all this stuff, it's very difficult to individually tailor what you do, which really would be sort of the optimized way to approach it, is that if we know that Wednesday is going to be the day that we actually go a little hard in between match weekends, you certainly would want to be aware of what that other player is doing on Tuesday or for even beforehand on Wednesday, so that you could maybe try and avoid, loading that kid in a way that might be appropriate for some of their teammates, but not for them.
Yeah, I mean, the biggest takeaway on this for parents that are listening to this podcast is like, be transparent, because I think most coaches worth anything are going to be willing to work with you to help you do the things that you want to do, and do them in, I guess, what would be the safest way possible. I mean, to me, that's what this is screaming to people is, hey, don't be secretive about it. And and I don't know what you think about this, Drew, but we've all had a bunch of kids always who are run track or whatever, and a lot of times it's even positioned like, hey, I don't even have to go to track practice, I just show up to the meets and run, which is like, wow. As someone who runs long distances, I'm sure you're like, oh my God, don't do that. You're not trained for that. But even something as simple as just knowing that the kid's doing that and being able to talk with the kid to see how they're feeling so that you can manage them through their training can be very valuable. Because you can put cover for that kid with the other kids and just say, hey, this is what, so that's how we can help players do the things that they want to do rather than,
Well, it's no different, Doug, I think, than as somebody's returning to play from injury, they don't jump into a full fitness session in the first week. They may do every second or third interval of whatever it is as they're ramping up, so you don't create an issue for them in that. In the same way, you could do that for somebody who's doing another sport, and that you say, okay, we're going to change the physical load for you on these high load days because your body's already being pushed hard.
Yeah. And being cleared doesn't mean you're ready to play in a game, right? It means, okay, now we can start working you towards being ready to play in a game. So, I mean, we could go lots of directions.
Well, you can measure the quality of physical therapist on that sort of comment of, hey, you've cleared all the in-lab tests, so now go ahead and play.
I can play this weekend.
But what do you think about this question, Drew? Because my gut, and now we're going into some more subjective area here, but is that outside of a formal training environment, so on their own, for example, playing on their own for fun, kids are pretty good at self-regulating in terms of their load. When they get really tired when they're playing in the backyard 3v3, they tend to stop, or they slow down, or they take a break. And so I guess my question would be, this is more prevalent in formal environments than it is in pickup soccer or informal environments. It would be my gut, because my observation is that players sort of monitor themselves in those situations. They don't push through things, when they're playing for fun in the backyard or in a pickup down the road or whatever it may be.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I mean, there is some degree to which athletes are going to push harder when, they're in a competitive environment. Coaches are on top of them. They're not going to self-regulate quite the same way that they would. Maybe like a little bit of an aside and just sort of an observational thing we picked up as we were doing this research over a few years is that the amount that even so like during these fall seasons, right, this particular group was basically all just playing soccer. It was really like, did they do stuff other times of the year? But even if you look at the volume of training load that they do outside of formal practice, because we had them report, like, where did you do this? It's not small. It was like 20 to 25% of the total load was actually on their own. And obviously, this is a very sort of committed and high level group that's doing a lot of individual work. But if you don't measure that, or if you don't have any idea of that, you also may not have an idea of what the total loads are. And they will self-regulate, I think, on their own when they're doing those things. I might just make the point that it's not a negligible amount of time and total load that they spend on their own, which is all the more, like, I tend to be pretty heavy-handed about athlete monitoring. And that's just one other reason, is if you don't know about that information, You really can't be quite as narrowly prescriptive about how you load athletes as you would otherwise.
So, so we're talking a lot about specialization here. We started with the, again, I'll say the moral blackmail of, oh, if you specialize, you are going to hurt yourself, and we're sort of pushing back on that to say, be careful. But again, if the data comes out differently, then it's information that is important for people to factor into decisions. But if it's inaccurate, then it shouldn't even be brought up. What about, because you hinted at it, this just general discussion of specialization and a kid who, I mean, at some point, every player decides they want to, well, I shouldn't say that. At some point, a lot of players who have more ambition decide they want to focus more on one sport. Not everybody, but it's certainly not, for most people, it's not age 8. For most people, it's not age 18. It's somewhere in the middle. How do you handle that? How would you suggest handling that discussion? And I know there's not data, and there's also probably similarly over-aggrandized statements about multi-sport athletes lead to X outcomes. And I do think there's a correlation causation issue in a lot of those studies. But how do you suggest that topic of specialization or not with a player?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And just to maybe like unpack a little of it, the there are real hurdles around the way that information gets disseminated currently in society. Like nuanced, thoughtful, intellectually honest conversations are hard in a tweet, right? Like we everything sort of gets boiled down to however many characters, when in reality it's pretty complicated, and a lot of the decision making is very highly individual based on the individual kid, the family, their opportunities. So the one size fits all short little quip on social media to me is sort of meaningless. And I would say one of the knock on sort of sad effects that we see once in a while in clinic, and I'm not going to say this happens every day, but we will occasionally have a kid that comes in who's playing multiple sports at the same time. And that was sort of how they got, in my opinion, what led them to get hurt. And when you unpack it, they were like, well, we had heard that just playing one sport was bad. And so we're doing more than one. And in reality, that like went completely in the other direction to the way that it should have, as a consequence of just sort of inadequate messaging. So, I think for me, the conversations that I have with families and athletes about this are very individualized, and they really are intended to incorporate a whole host of different factors. But just like broad strokes, I actually think that the work that was getting done in the 90s and the 2000s about sort of rough models of long-term athletic development were pretty good. And they basically just said, elementary school age, try lots of stuff, generate a broad base of athleticism, experiment with enough things to find what you enjoy doing. And then if you get to sort of middle school, 13 years old, and you really find that you like one thing more than others, then you sort of narrow in on that. If you continue to enjoy doing multiple things, then you continue to enjoy doing multiple things. And for me, I think what I really try and hammer, publicly, but also individually with families, is that all of that should really be driven on what kids are interested in doing. I think we run into trouble when we swap out the goals that kids build for themselves and replace them with somebody else's goals or something that's in service of social standing or anything else that sort of perverts the child's love of whatever they're doing. But I think there's a great role for experimentation and sampling at young ages to build out just sort of broader movement patterns and figure out what you like. And then once you get to that sort of 13, 14, maybe 12 in some cases, if you really like doing one thing and that kid has their own intrinsic motivation and goals to go after it, then just support them and allow them to do it. Don't get in the way of it and sort of demand that they do multiple things, particularly not multiple things at the same time. I don't think any of that is in service of their long-term health.
Yeah, I think I agree 100% with that. Every kid has a different path. Every kid has different interests and aspirations. Every kid has different developmental, physical, emotional, and mental rates and times at which they reach whatever the next stage would be defined as. It's very hard in that scenario to say you must be on this path, making these decisions at this time frame. There are decisions that have to be made over the course of a developing kid, turning into a young adult. And those things probably also correlate 100% with aspiration at some level, right? I guess we push back, and Doug, you may have a comment on this, but we push back, I think, very strongly on these statements that say that there is one or a small number of pathways to success that everybody must fit into, regardless of their individual circumstance or nuance.
Yeah, and there's not enough evidence that there's one path, right? The evidence is there's, to both your points, lots of different ways you can do it. So yeah, I totally agree. And I think in a lot of ways, the social media kind of packaging, small bite packaging is, removes a lot of the nuance that is a fact in all these kinds of things. So yeah, totally agree.
Well, and it can go the opposite. I mean, I think about, my oldest son played baseball for a year because he wanted to play baseball. And then after a year, he didn't want to play baseball because he didn't enjoy it, which was fine with me because I don't particularly enjoy it. So sorry for anybody out there who loves baseball. That's just my opinion. But it would be a pretty messed up statement to say, well, you need to play baseball because you're going to develop hand-eye coordination that's going to be positive for your long-term movement ranges. And so I'm going to force you to play baseball because of a long-term overall athletic goal. I mean, it sounds silly even saying, and it's exaggerated by on purpose, but that wouldn't make any more sense than doing it the opposite way.
I mean, I am genuinely sympathetic for families because I think it is so hard to get good information and so easy to get sort of misguided or at least relatively uninformative information. I think it is a real challenge to try and navigate this in some ways because, I mean, I got a whole rant about like social media and the attention economy, but nobody's going to click on a post that's sort of like long-winded, thoughtful, says these decisions should be made individually, talk with healthcare providers, talk with coaches, talk with other people and develop a very sort of individualized thing. What does get clicked on is something that says like, here's how you're doing it wrong and you're going to threaten your entire child's future if you don't do this. Right. And it doesn't matter, like, just to leverage a word that I know, Christian, you like, that's orthogonal to reality, right? Like the sensationalistic post may or may not have anything to do with the underlying reality. And the truth is that it is extremely complicated to try and figure out what the quote unquote path is to success, whatever your outcome is. And reality doesn't really care if it's hard for us to measure or appreciate or talk about. It just is. And it's complicated. And every kid kind of deserves to have an individualized, thoughtful approach to it, which is where I think like good coaches come in. Like I have these conversations when kids get hurt, but I don't have them ahead of time. Like thoughtful coaches can be an extraordinary resource to have these kinds of individualized real world conversations. And I would just say, like, just to be sort of like nostalgic, it is sort of sad for me to see things like well-funded and resourced physical education go away, because I think that is a way that a lot of kids can build broad-based movement patterns and experiment with sports. And that continually just sort of gets chipped away in service of other things. And I think that probably undermines kids' abilities to identify the sport they really like or build out enough sort of athletic groundwork to succeed in multiple things. It's sort of off topic, but I do think that's one of the issues is it can be very hard to find ways for kids to sample lots of stuff. Well-funded physical education was a great way to do that. And the more you take that away, the harder it gets.
Well, and we had talked, and we're not going to get into it on this podcast out of time, but maybe it's one of the next ones, because if this podcast is about sort of taking a more nuanced and intellectual approach to decisions on sports specialization and saying, hey, don't just immediately assume that specialization equals injury risk. There's also tangentially related to that, and I see this now here in sort of a crazy soccer environment of Southern California, of people feeling that early specialization and probably attached in some ways to that early success is this guarantee of long-term success. Or if you're the best player at age 7, 9, 11, whatever it is, that you're almost there, and you're gonna be that best player at 18 if you just keep, doing whatever it is you're doing. And that's another area that is so misunderstood that I'm staggered by the amount of people that don't realize that there's almost zero correlation between top players at age 8 and top players at age 18. That they just it's, and maybe because it's different in sport than it is in academia, but people are so mistakenly believing that early identification, which I do think there's some early specialization that starts to be not because the kid wants it, but because, hey, I'm really good, and therefore if I keep doing this, I'm going to stay really good. And that is just not as attractive as that may be in some people's mind. It's not true.
Yeah, I think there's a psychological developmental piece around decision making here too, because I mean, I tend to belabor this idea that we should sort of be like following the kids' goals, following the kids' aspirations. I'm not sure that totally works at age 8 or 9 because they're probably just reflecting back my goals that I am unwittingly giving to them. And I totally agree that early, heavy investment in a single activity at a young age, meaning like 8, 9, 10, really does not seem to draw a strong correlation with long-term success. There is some evidence that it tends to pay off in the short term. And I think that's why this is so hard, is that you get this sort of like perceived immediate return on investment, or like you're looking over at somebody else's kid and you're like, boy, they're going to 8 different physical
Yeah.
trainers and he's really hitting it out of the park right now. But it doesn't translate into long-term success. And it's very hard to convince people of that when they're getting that short-term return, because it seems like you said, just keep doing it. But unfortunately, a lot of those early successful athletes, when you're talking about sort of like real high levels of competition, sort of fall out by the time you get to like 18, 19. And a lot of players bubble up who probably were doing lots of different things when they were 8, 9, and 10, maybe sort of
Or
broadening
just
their skill acquisition.
or just struggling and,
Yeah, or
getting
late for
more
development.
resilience. And a kid who doesn't have to struggle, then maybe loses their, you know, desire to continue to develop because they think they're already there. Like, I think there's just so many factors in that are, we can unpack, again on a future.
Well, there's another one that just jumps to my mind, which is the difference between blocked and I think it's intermittent practice, right? I believe I'm saying those correctly, but for example, block practice would be um, if I'm going to practice finishing, and I say I'm going to cut in from the left side and I'm going to try and bend the ball into the far post with my right foot, and I'm going to do that 100 times in a row. You think that that is the best way to get really good at that shot. And again, the studies show in the short term, you show significant improvement, but the learning doesn't stick as much as if you do, okay, this shot I'm going to bend with my right foot to the far post. The next shot I'm going to drive to the near post. Then the third shot I'm going to try and chip. And then the fourth shot I'm going to bend again. But the studies show to change long-term performance, you need more of that intermittent changing. Now, I'm not saying there's not a role for a block repetition on things, especially when maybe you're learning first movement mechanics related with it. But and Drew, I assume you've seen some of these studies that say that. But you do see short-term returns on repetitive things that don't seem to correlate and translate into long-term skill acquisition in long-term memory.
Yeah, and I think this probably generalizes to other sports, but it may be particularly true in soccer, if for no other reason than the characteristics that are sort of successful at 12 years old in soccer are not the same as the ones that make you successful at 19. Like you can be quite successful at 12 years old as a function of largely physical characteristics and a couple skills, and nobody can manage that. But if you're talking about a player who at 18 or 19 is dynamic and unpredictable and clever in addition to being sort of physically gifted, it's a very different set of things. So it isn't like we got to identify these four things you got to do at 12 and then we just get better at those four for 8 years. In reality, like the things that predicate success at older ages aren't quite like younger ages. And I wonder if that's not more the case in soccer than other sports.
Well,
and I would just double down on that real quick by saying that the other issue I have with not, I mean, I realize this is sort of vanishing everywhere, but with sort of at 8 years old or 9 years old being like, okay, we're going to go to all these scheduled people and all of these sort of experts to tailor different parts of your game. What you surely sacrifice is opportunities to play either on your own or with friends in free play scenarios, which obviously this is another nostalgia piece, but like the prospect of playing in groups without supervision actually is a pretty good incubator for dynamism and cleverness and creativity that sometimes you can't necessarily create in other environments, especially with young kids. You get to play against bigger kids, younger kids. And I recognize that the neighborhood park is not what it used to be. But if you try and make all of these activities and skill acquisitions really highly constrained, I think you lose some of what you get out of kids playing on their own.
all right. So I think we can summarize this podcast as be careful. It depends. I'm not sure.
I don't know.
I don't know. Think deeper. Be more individualized in your thinking and planning. And with all of that done, then you will have a better understanding of all the factors, and nothing is going to be totally certain. But I would joke slightly, but I think it's one of the goals of the center when it was set up and we talked about it, Drew, was one, to educate on things that would help everybody, parent, player, coach, do better things in athlete development on the field, off the field. And also the kind of corollary to that is myth bust, where there is opinions that, or broadly held thoughts anyway, that are just not right. And I think I put this soccer study in a little bit of both, of myth bust, a little bit of this grossly generic statement about specialization and injury. Don't throw it all out. But be aware and be more thoughtful, because I think, Doug, the topic and the discussion of just managing, who is managing a kid who's doing a lot of different things. And the answer is, if nobody knows except the parent, well, then the parent's going to be the one managing the load for periodization. And if you tell the coaches, then you might get some more guided, in hopefully informative, enlightened opinions that might help the parent in that. But I think
Well,
this is an interesting topic.
if the parent's managing it, it's not going to go well, because the reality is the coaches are the ones that are controlling their
Well,
environment.
the average parent who's does not have a sporting background or a medical background or whatever, yes, yes. But I think these things aren't so complicated that they can't be generally understood to a parent, of saying, hey, if your kid's going to play multiple sports at the same time, you should tell the coaches so that they can balance it. And you should be looking out, mom, dad, for signs that your kid is exhausted, or signs that your kid is doing too much, and here's what it may look like. And here are some generalized do's and don'ts as you manage that. That could help a parent do a lot.
Agreed.
Yeah, I would say like for the center part, the overarching goal of that was really we wanted to try and give good information to players and families and coaches that they could use to help make decisions within youth soccer. And in a lot of areas, there is soccer information, and we would try and aggregate that and deliver it in an understandable and applicable way. But when we found that there really wasn't relevant information within youth soccer, then we would do the research ourselves. And this is sort of iterated multiple times. We've had things where we felt like there was a lot of good evidence and we could translate it into youth soccer. And there have been several times where we've just done the research because we felt like we couldn't extrapolate what we had from, basketball or pro soccer down to kids. And this is just one more example where it is entirely possible that there are sports where there's a very strong causal relationship between specialization and injury. But the information at hand to me wasn't enough to be able to guide a family around soccer specifically. So we did the research to try and answer the question. And at least for my part at this point, from what we've seen, we don't see an obvious relationship between specialization and injury within youth soccer players. And I think this is kind of emblematic of what we're trying to do within the center in order to guide the conversations that families have within themselves and with their coaches to help serve the players in and around the league.
All right. Well, I think, Doug, I'm good with a wrap on that, if you're good.
Yeah, we're ready for the Bracken Brain Buster. Didn't do it while I was gone, which you would have had to call it something else. And the other thing I want to say before I ask this question, which is highly related to what we talked about today, is that if you two are going to continue to use big words, I'm going to ask you to do a spin-off podcast and do that stuff somewhere else. What was the word you said, Drew?
Orthogonal?
Yes, orthogonal.
Orthogonal.
I only used it because I heard Christian use it on this podcast, but I'm not afraid of big words, Doug, and I won't tolerate that anti-intellectualism.
What I'm going to say
as
to you is
precisely as possible.
Right now, you're bloviating, and
welcome aboard, Doug. Welcome
from
aboard.
this podcast.
There is a quintessence of big words being used.
Okay. Well, I'm happy to be back and ask this question. And I wrote this question down before we started, and it's hilarious because how much it applies to what we talked about. And we might have already done this for people in a large way, but let's individualize this and say, if you could give one piece of advice to a new soccer parent, what would it be? And you can say sports parent if you want. This is a soccer podcast, but if you could give one piece of advice, and I'm going to go first today. I never go first, but I will go first because I like my answer. I don't want somebody to take it before I say it. My answer to the question of what advice would I give to a parent is let your kid be the driver of their development. This is not about your experience, it's about their experience. So let the kid drive the ship. If they want to do private training, then do private training, right? But let them be the ones that drive the ship. I think it means more longevity for them in sport because they're doing it for them and we're supporting them as they do it for themselves and not necessarily for us. So that's my piece of advice. I'm going to go to Ryan Bothman, new face on the podcast, not a new face in the ECNL. He's an old face. But what do you think, Ryan?
I would say just I think stay out of coaching the team. I think that was kind of my experience in sports coming up was there's too many cooks in the kitchen sometimes, too many people trying to get involved coaching the team. And it, especially in baseball, I play a lot of baseball and that made it a lot worse sometimes. So I think everybody just stay out of that and let the coaches of the team handle it.
Okay, love that. Let's go to our esteemed guest, Dr. Drew.
Man, this is tough, Doug. I've been a soccer parent for like 8 years, and I still don't know what I would tell myself 8 years ago.
I got some ideas. Talk about that offline.
I mean, I would say, initially I was like, try and imagine what you want this to be in service of as you imagine your kid when they're 18 and leaving, which is just sort of what I think about all the time with a senior and a sophomore in high school. But actually, like looking back, the most valuable thing I ever got, and I think that still kind of serves my daughter, is just to have lots of conversations with your kids about sports. Not the like drive home from the game when you lost and you're like finger pointing and stuff, but just communicate with your kid about what it's like, what they're enjoying, who their friends are that they're making, which parts are challenging, and you figure out pretty quickly after having long conversations what the best way is to support them. You know, I used to think of it as sort of a hassle that my daughter and I drove a long way for her soccer trainings and then obviously for a lot of events. But now that, you know, she's older and a teenager and running around, those are some of the best memories we have, is sitting in the car, talking about sports, having conversations, letting it go wherever, not in a way where I was trying to coach her, but just in a way where she got to talk about what it was like and what she wanted to do. And those, to me, now that, you know, we're starting to close the chapter on my kids' childhood, are some of the most valuable memories I have.
Love that. Let's go to Christian Lavers.
I think I would say don't make it a roller coaster. And I say that because I believe that kids mirror the emotions and reactions of their parents a lot. And the younger they are, maybe the more so they do that. And when the parent is on a roller coaster of ups and downs, even the ups, there's a thing as having too much up. Because they do, you know, you can have great success, but then every kid is going to go through times when they don't. And if you've made a huge deal out of the success, then the lack of it is a big deal as well, because there it is so directly in opposition to what it felt like before. So in some ways, I think the job of a parent is to help make the inevitable ups and downs a little less up and down and a little more straight.
Okay. And you have your hands full because you're in it.
Well, listen, I think people don't see the negative of again, I use the same word I used earlier, over-aggrandizing success at a young age. Because we all know, let's just pretend that that kid who's really good is going to be really good in 10 years. They're going to go through a period in that 10 years where they're not. And in that moment, if you've made too much out of success early, it's hard to dig out of that because you've already signaled to the kid that success is a really, really big deal. Therefore, then when you hit a bump and it's not, that's a really big deal too.
Drives kids away from playing a lot of
It
times.
does. You know, we talk about it. And listen, I'm competitive. My wife is competitive. Like, we hate to lose on anything. So you can't flip that switch off in some ways. But the one thing you look at is you say, and I think it mirrors what you said, Drew, is the one thing you want out of sports is you want them to be able to keep playing because they want to keep playing. Not saying one day, you know what, Dad, I don't want to go to practice today. In fact, I don't want to play anymore. That's what you don't want to hear, especially if you think there's something in the environment that caused it.
Yeah, I think
Or you caused it.
Yeah, again, we all make mistakes, right? And so I think these are things of like, just keep in your mind. You know, somebody said once in coaching that I thought was a great advice is your intervention for you or for them?
Yeah, I think kids get a lot of validation out of what they see from their parents' responses to what they do. And if you're not careful, they might think you don't love them as much if they don't succeed, even though you never say it as much. So for me, when I'm talking about like longer conversations around these things, one of the nice take homes from that is that win, lose, draw, perform well or bad, I love you and I'm here for you either way. And whatever you decide is what we're going to do.
Yeah. All right, Jacob, bring us home.
I think the one thing that we all have said multiple times on this podcast is that number one, we want the kids to have fun. So make sure that the sport is fun. But number two, piggybacking off of what Doug said and what Christian said is I think the kids need to be the decision maker in the sense of when I was growing up, my parents were always making sure that I wanted to play the sport and making sure that I wasn't doing it because I thought I had to or because I thought that they wanted me to. I got to make those decisions. And I was really appreciative of that because actually, when I was in middle school, I quit playing soccer because it was too much running, but then I came back to it in high school. When I got cut from my high school's hockey program, it was up to me to decide if I wanted to keep playing hockey for a different high school or if I was going to hang up the skates, and I kept playing. So being able to give the kids the confidence to make their own decisions and to drive their own sports career, I think is really important.
I do want to add one thing, not to steal your thunder, because I thought you brought it home excellently. But I always, anytime somebody says have fun, we want to make sure it's fun. I agree with you, but I will always harken back to what my one of my college coaches said to me, and there's a difference between having fun and being happy. And sport, like a sport, should make you happy. It doesn't mean it's always going to be fun, because it will not always be fun. But so I always like to replace the word fun with happy, because I think fun can be very like fleeting. Happiness is something that's a little bit more, sustainable, I guess, if you will. So hopefully I improved on your answer there, Jacob.
Yeah, no, great point.
So that's all we got today. I think this was a great conversation. I think it's there's so much that just gets kind of vomited out into the universe now about and people, can certainly pose as experts on different topics. And this is the idea of specialization is certainly one of them. So having you on, Drew, and having you clear that and make, have some real kind of data conversations about this, I think is super important for people to hear.
Yeah, I think the best thing we can ever do is be as honest as we can, and that's definitely what we're trying for. I've got my work cut out for me to figure out who number 2 and 1 are and how to move my way up this podcasting guest podium.
Well, let's talk with you. I mean, we're an hour and a half later, and he's still thinking back to the bronze medal.
You did well today. You did well. Today, we're happy with you.
I appreciate that, Doug.
Yes, you got it.
Always a pleasure, guys. Thank you. And as always, looking for any suggestions of topics, questions, areas we can go deeper. Appreciate all that.
See you guys in a couple weeks.